Welcome to Parks Uncut. My name is Monica and I'm the Parks Manager for Kensington and Chelsea. We all know parks as great places to visit and the benefits they have for people, but parks and green spaces play a much bigger role in our environment beyond recreational space. Green spaces act as carbon stores. Vegetation and soil stores carbon for a long time, prevent it from returning to the atmosphere, and this is called carbon sequestration. Green spaces also help with our air quality, putting oxygen back into the atmosphere and helping with air pollution. And they also cool the air as well, reducing the heat island effect of the city and also help prevent flooding, as well as providing a home for wildlife. And it's these last two functions that we're going to look at in a bit more detail today. So joining me are Alice, James and Jonathan for a quick Q&A. So thanks for joining us on the podcast. What are your roles in the borough?
My name is James Latham. I'm the Principal Flood and Water Management Officer here at the Council, and I coordinate everything to do with flood risk management and drainage across the Council.
I'm Alice Lawton. I'm the Ecology Service Manager, and I'm responsible for delivering the Biodiversity Action Plan in the borough, which includes creating habitats for wildlife and delivering our Access to Nature programme.
And I'm Jonathan Wade. I'm Head of Spatial Planning, so I head up three teams in particular. So those are the Planning Policy team that deals with local plan and planning guidance, the Design and Heritage team that deal with conservation areas, listed buildings and urban design, and the Growth and Delivery team. So that covers various different projects in the borough, but it also involves site delivery, but also looking at sort of high streets and where we can improve social assets and other matters in the borough.
Brilliant, thanks. So we've got three experts to talk us through how we're supporting flooding and, flood alleviation and wildlife in the borough. So James, we'll start with you. So there's lots of different terms that we hear when it comes to flooding, flood alleviation. So I'm just going to ask you for a quick rundown of a few of them. So what do we mean by water cycle and what does this look like in the borough?
Yeah, so water cycle, as you might have learnt in school geography, about rain falling, going over land into the sea and back into the clouds. But actually in the borough it's quite complicated because historically, when it was farmland in the kind of up to the mid-19th century, water would just flow over the farmland, through the ground, into a river. So we used to have a river called the Countess Creek that ran down through the borough and then out into the River Thames and into the sea. But over time, that's been built over the past couple of hundred years. So now we've got a more complicated water cycle where actually water falling on a roof goes into a sewer. It's a combined sewer, so it's all joined together with it, all the other water that is produced. And then it goes through the sewer network and in really heavy events, rainfall events, goes into the River Thames. So we've gone from a really natural water cycle to a much more man-made water cycle.
So I guess the ideal situation is to try and get more water back into the natural cycle. Yeah,
exactly. And it's also going to a man-made cycle. Water gets much quicker into the sewers than it would have done going across land. So wanting to slow it down, wanting to make it much more naturalised on its way through, slowing it through the process really helps in managing flooding.
Okay, so I guess, but doesn't putting more water into the ground mean potentially more? Would that equal more flooding at sort of basement level? I know we've got a lot of basement flats in the borough. I know that sort of groundwater is a concern for some people. So how do we get that balance? How does that work?
Yeah, and groundwater is a concern for residents. I think, separating out the different ways in which water can get into properties that are at risk of flooding is important. So quite a lot of the properties that have been affected by flooding are the existing kind of lower ground floors, and they predominantly flood through kind of the sewer network getting back into water from the sewer getting back into those properties. So but with basements, we've got quite strict planning policies to make sure that anyone putting in a new basement, that needs to be not risk of flooding, but also is not increasing the risk of flooding elsewhere. So we've got quite good protections in policy about basements. But there are places where there is a water table that's relatively shallow, and it harks back to where there was a river, and alongside a river you have gravels and terrace gravels above the clay. So it means that in places there is kind of a water table below ground. So we need to make sure that there are provisions in place, there are protections for those properties.
So what do we mean by the water table in sort of simple terms?
Yeah, so basically, in some parts of the borough, there's basically, if you dig a hole, there'll be some water. Quite a lot of the borough, there won't be any water if you dug a hole, and that's because we've mainly got clay beneath a lot of the areas. But in some areas, particularly in the south and along the west of the borough, if you went down far enough, there would be standing water in there, and it's really useful as a resource for plants to take up to use. But it means that if anything happens in terms of development, we need to make sure that there's not kind of an impact associated with that.
Okay, so I guess what can we do, and what can the council do, and what are the council doing to manage flood risk?
Yeah, so we've unfortunately had a couple of serious flood incidents. The most recent was in July 2021. We know of over 500 properties that have been affected by flooding there, and it's likely to be more than that. It's just the number that we've been reported. Before that, we had flooding in July 2007. Over 600 properties affected then. Before that, in August 1960, many streets were affected. So there is a history of flooding. It's a real thing. So we need to make sure as a council we have a strategy for managing the risk of flooding. So we've got a new one that was adopted this February, and basically what it does is looks at making sure that communities and residents are aware of flooding. They're aware that they're at risk of flooding, because that's really important. If you don't know about it, then you don't know what steps you can do yourself. But one of the main things is exactly what we said at the beginning. It's slowing the flow of water as it's going through the landscape, the urban landscape, or even the natural landscape. So there are places where, like in Holland Park, where water, it's natural, but it does run down the footpaths. It runs quite quickly off the landscape. So doing things to slow the flow of water through the landscape before it gets to the sewer is really important, because it breaks that cycle of the water going quickly and then coming into people's properties.
Yeah, so I guess there is lots of different ways to slow it down and get water back in the ground. You hear a lot of different terms like sustainable urban drainage, rain gardens, natural flood management. What is the difference? Is there a difference, or do they all basically do the same thing?
They do a similar thing in general, and it's about managing water in a more sustainable way. In terms of the terms, so sustainable drainage systems, or SUDS, is a mandatory requirement for lots of planning applications. But what it means in principle is where you've got an urban landscape, putting in interventions to slow the flow of water. It can be really simple things like a water butt, or a planter attached to a downpipe, or changing the surface. So what hard landscaping you put in, making sure that that's permeable, making sure the water can soak into the ground. So it can be really simple things. It doesn't need to be a really complicated technical thing. When you're talking about a term like natural flood management, that's about, as water's working its way through landscapes, it's working with natural processes to make sure that the water is going in the right place and being used and slowed down, so that it's breaking the cycle, but using much more natural interventions. Basically recreating having beavers in landscapes in a way, because beavers are excellent at breaking down that cycle. I think we're probably potentially a little bit too urban to introduce beavers, but what we can do is we can recreate what beavers do in landscapes where it's appropriate to slow the flow of water.
So it sounds like sort of creating green space and planting and, has a lot to do with this. And actually then that links in quite nicely with, I guess, the idea of habitat creation and the work that Alice does, so in supporting wildlife. So it sounds like there are mutual benefits there for creating for flood alleviation measures and creating more green space and supporting wildlife. So I'm just going to come to you, Alice, for a second. One of the questions we get asked quite a lot is what we mean, like what wildlife we're trying to support. So what does wildlife in the borough look like?
So when people think of wildlife, they generally think of animals. So we've got quite a big mix of mammals, we've got a huge mix of invertebrates, and we've got bats, we've got common lizards, we've got amphibians, we've got lots of newts and toads and frogs. But you can also extend it to think of it to encompass all living things. So we can also think of it in terms of the planting, and also things like the microbes in the soil, which are really important for soil health. So it's really thinking about how everything we're doing impacts all of that. And in terms of what wildlife we have in the borough, I mean, for an inner city borough, we have a really big diversity of green spaces, lots of different types of habitat. We've got scrubland, we've got woodland, we've got water features. And we do have people might be surprised at the range of wildlife we have. We have tawny owls, we have sparrowhawks, we have lots of different bat species. We had one of our habitat interventions particularly in Holland Park, but in all the parks, is to try and leave deadwood where it falls, which is a great habitat for invertebrates. And last year I found 3 stag beetles, which are a priority species for London in Holland Park, which was the most that we've seen in a number of years. So it's really doing those interventions and then hopefully seeing the impact they have on helping the wildlife to thrive.
Thanks. And how does wildlife move around the borough?
So wildlife will move in different ways. If you think about birds, some birds have huge migrations, they can fly very long distances. Other birds have much smaller wings and smaller territories, and they just move from smaller place to place, might be within the same park. And similarly with insects. So what we try and think about is the connectivity between our green spaces. So in the borough we have 24 sinks, which are sites of importance for nature conservation, which is the spaces. They're mostly, a lot of our parks are sinks. They're the areas that have been identified as being sort of the best habitats or examples of habitats that we have in the borough, and they get an extra sort of layer of protection in our policy. But we also have 4 blue and green corridors. So we have the Thames and we have Regent's Canal, which are 2 blue corridors, and then we also have green corridors along the train lines, which might be a surprise to people because when you're going on the train, you look out the window, it doesn't look like a very exciting habitat, but actually the sort of the scrub and the buddleias and the sort of rudimental plants that grow up along train lines are really useful corridors. They're great for wildlife to commute down, bats forage along them. And so what we're doing is looking at how we can create more of those green corridors. Our habitat survey that was carried out across the borough in 2022 identified where those opportunities are to link habitats together, and we have other projects like the Superhighway, which is trying to plant spaces in between the larger green spaces to provide those stepping stones so that wildlife can move freely around and thrive.
Thanks, Alice. So thinking about sort of greening and a lot of the planting that you've both sort of discussed, it fits quite nicely with the flood alleviation and supporting wildlife. What can our residents do to help?
Yeah, so I think in terms of flood risk management, it's understanding that for lots of the properties that are at risk of flooding, water has gone from somewhere to get into those properties. So even just looking at the spaces around where you live, either that you own or just the small areas. And thinking about how water is managed in those areas would be really important. I think, if you've got small terrace or garden, then thinking about kind of what hard paving there is in those areas, and reducing it by a small amount, or putting planters on those just to slow the flow. It may not, protect properties from flooding, but individually, but cumulatively, if it's about slowing the flow of water, it could be really important. There are things that could be done. For instance, putting a water butt so that you have water available in the summer when you need it, because it's not just flooding that's predicted to get potentially worse in the future. So we could have droughts at the same time as floods, at the same time as heat waves. So actually having something like a water butt gives a resource, but actually takes some of that water away from the sewer.
Brilliant. So if people are then putting pots and planters and doing some of those small interventions just to help, how can they make sure that those also have good benefits for wildlife?
So whatever sort of size of outdoor space you might have access to, you can always do something to help wildlife. If you're lucky enough to have a garden or a balcony, the RHS has a great plants for pollinators list, and they can be multi-purpose. So for example, if you had a balcony, if you might want to grow herbs for your cooking, quite a lot of those are really beneficial for pollinators. So like thyme and rosemary, pollinators absolutely love the flowers from those. If you do have a garden, one of the best things you can do if you have artificial grass is please take it up. Similarly, if you've got a front garden that's hard standing, is there any opportunity, if you have a bins stored out there, to make a little bin store with a green roof? They're really brilliant. Also, if you do have an area of grass, you could try not mowing it, or building sort of log piles, which are really great for invertebrates. Obviously, you could put up bird boxes, or you can buy different types of bug hotels or create your own. There's actually a website for an initiative called Buzz Club, which is linked to the University of Sussex, which is all about projects that anyone can get involved in to do biodiversity monitoring, but they also have lots of great ideas for wildlife habitats you can make using recycled everyday materials like milk bottles and mugs and all sorts of things. So there's lots of ideas for what you can do there.
Brilliant, thanks Alice. I need to have a look at that website. So I guess the big takeaway is that even really small interventions can contribute to the bigger picture and ultimately make a big difference across the borough for both flood alleviation and wildlife. And now doing a big shift, completely turn around onto big interventions, development and planning policy, because you're all involved in planning policy and you're all involved in sort of helping set the direction for policy. So how does planning policy support flood alleviation, wildlife in the borough?
I think underlining it all is our local plan. So we're just about hopefully getting to a stage where we can adopt a new local plan, and hopefully that will happen later this year. To me, it's all about integration. So planning policy is part of that, but it's really looking at sort of multiple strands of looking at planning policy. So in terms of sort of spatial planning and the wider approach, I mentioned about 3 teams. All of those are sort of integrated in some ways into outcomes, and I think that's what we really want to concentrate on, is outcomes. So, I mean, in the local plan itself, we will have planning policy that will look to provide additional open space on larger development sites where that's possible. If you look at our 2 opportunity areas, Earls Court and Kensal Canal side, we are very keen on making sure that additional open space is not only provided for residents on that site, but also it could be used in terms of sort of wider community facilities, and particularly I think Earls Court has some scope to do that. And this is an area where Some parts of the borough do not have a lot of public open space. So I think it's really important that we try and target those. But it's not just about bigger open space, it's about smaller open space as well. So in terms of planning policy from that particular perspective, not only do we protect all our open space, but it's important that we take opportunities to provide more open space where we can do that. And in terms of sort of wildlife and biodiversity, biodiversity net gain has come in this year, so we do need to provide sort of 10% biodiversity net gain on our larger sites and our medium sites. So we are looking closely to try and provide that on site where that's possible. But there's lots of different facets to it, to be honest. There's the flooding policies that James has mentioned. There's making sure that, when we build basements, that we're not building them too large, that they've actually got proper drainage. So it really covers a whole raft of different areas. And in fact, something that we're just rolling out at the moment is retrofitting. So we're looking at a number of retrofitting guides, including one for SUDs, which will come out later this spring, and that will also cover many facets of sustainability. And I would say they're all quite interlinked. So even things that are not just sort of green roofs, but retrofitting your house and making it close to zero carbon is all contributing to climate change. Mitigating climate change. So yes, and even with placemaking, I mean, with our growth and delivery team, they're producing a number of guidelines for different streets in the borough. We're looking at Portobello Road at the moment. It's really important that we embed SUDs as part of the approach to all those schemes. So it's really sort of looking at a whole raft of different policies, and I think joining them up in a sort of placemaking manner, which I'm very keen that we try and do, so that you're sort of coordinating different work and making sure that all our work streams, including what Alice does, is really part of a really holistic approach to both wildlife and SUDs.
So I guess the planning policy really resists activity that we think is going to be harmful on a wider scale, and also, but enables, like we said, with retrofitting, enables things that we think are actually going to be more widely beneficial. So more widely beneficial against the environment.
Totally. I mean, I think some people think the planning system is all about trying to stop things from happening. We definitely are not trying to stop things from happening, but what we do want to see coming forward is good growth and shaping new development in an appropriate way. Yeah. And I think that's really what planning policy is about. There won't be many planning policies that will stop anything from happening. I mean, clearly, if it's loss of open space, particularly public open space, yes, that's something that we will be robust about. But it's really more about sort of providing those opportunities and making sure they're explored properly in terms of sort of increasing our biodiversity, increasing our wildlife, increasing the opportunities that we can put in sustainable urban drainage systems and other measures that can really help. We've got this climate change issue. Clearly, rainfall events are becoming more frequent, and it's something that we really do need to tackle.
Thank you for your time. This has been really insightful. We also recently had a visit from the Environment Agency and managed to nab one of their directors to explain a bit more about the importance of SUDs and her thoughts on our SUD scheme in Holland Park.
Hi, I'm Caroline Douglas, Executive Director for Flood and Coastal Risk Management with the Environment Agency. And sustainable urban drainage is a great way of helping to manage flash flooding in urban areas. It not only manages the water flow, but actually helps to provide some amenity and trees and green benefits for those urban places as well. So a great combination. And seeing what's been done here today at the Holland Park Adventure Playground, it's amazing the way the kids are engaging, the adults are having a look at how water can be integrated and managed in both a playground and a green environment to manage and control flash flooding in the future. So what a great idea for everybody and every generation.
All of the topics mentioned so far are also big considerations for us when we're looking at park improvements. Getting the balance right is key, and Christian has recorded a segment to explain how we do this.
So I'm Christian Harris, I'm Parks Project Manager at Kensington and Chelsea Council. So I'd like to talk a bit about parks and their importance in the environment, and also when we do projects, how we introduce parks to the environment. So the projects we deal with are really wide-ranging. So some of the things might be a children's play area that we completely redesign, or it might be a planting scheme, so putting in new trees, new shrubs, or it could even be that we're bringing in a piece of community art into the park. So at every step, what we need to make sure is that we consult with people, so we get their ideas, and also that we think about the impact of what we're doing, so that we're not doing anything negative in terms of the parks, but also that we're adding value to it as well. So adding value in terms of wildlife and making it a more enjoyable place for everyone to come to. So it really starts with consultation. So what I've noticed, especially since I've been at Kensington and Chelsea, is that everyone's very much switched on when it comes to the environment. So a lot of the comments that we get back is that people want more flowers, more plants for wildlife, especially trees as well. Trees is a massive one. So people keep saying we want more trees into our parks. And it's a real balancing act, because if we have too many trees, then you can't have other things. So you can't have particularly flowering plants. So it makes it very difficult to have grass, for instance, so lawns and things like that. So we do need to balance out what we're putting in, so that we can not only have just trees, we also have flowering plants that are good for pollinators, such as bees and butterflies, and also fruiting plants that are really good for, say, birds, so that they can enjoy those in the winter, eating the berries and things like that. So just talking about some of the schemes that I've been involved in. So Kensington Memorial Park, which is in the north of the borough. So we've got a really good project happening there. So we've got a new cafe being built, which also has new public toilets and an accessible places changing room. So on top of that, we're putting solar panels, so solar PV panels, so that all the electric use for that building can come from those solar panels, so it's a sustainable energy source. In that area as well, we're refurbishing the old sports changing room block. So rather than totally demolishing the old block, we're still using the wooden framework of that building. So we're recycling that. And on top of that building, we're putting a green roof. So that includes plants which flower, that pollinating bees and butterflies can enjoy. You won't actually see the green roof, but it's there, so we know that it's doing good. And also with that scheme, we've got a sustainable drainage system. So all the water that comes off the roofs, that will be going into a garden. So rather than that water going straight into the floodwater system, which could potentially cause flooding, that water goes through a garden, so it slowly percolates through it, so that we don't have so much of a likelihood that we would get flooding in that area. Another project that's just been completed is Ifield Road Playground. Now that's in Earl's Court. So I did consultation, worked very closely with Earl's Court Youth Club, got some really good feedback from residents, and as well as people wanting nice plants there and a really wide range of play equipment. They also made it clear that they wanted so benches that had backs and armrests, And that's not something you always think of naturally, but quite a lot of people who've got mobility problems, and particularly more older people, it's really important that they have really good backs to seats and armrests so that when they sit, they can sit comfortably. So that's something that we look to put in to our parks. And also with that playground, we looked at whether we could reuse equipment, we could reuse surfacing. So rather than stripping everything out and then taking that to, for instance, landfill, if we can reuse things as much as possible, it not only keeps the cost down, but it also means it's much more environmentally friendly. So we're reducing what we do, we reuse things, and we recycle as well. In Tavistock Gardens, we did a lot of consultation around improvements for that. And again, a lot of the residents said that they wanted things that are flowering, so flowering plants, also things with all year round interest. I mean, that's great if you have flowering plants, say in the early spring or the late autumn. So the bees and the butterflies have got things to pollen and nectar to eat all year round. And also they're really keen that we add fruiting plants as well. So things like fruit trees, so things like green gages, so that they could also pick those and make use of them for themselves. Another way that we managed to reduce our energy use is through technology. So at Kensington Memorial Park, we've got a water play area there that's really popular, but we found it wasn't very good in terms of using energy because the fountains were on all of the time. So we put in what's called a new control panel that can much more closely control when the fountains are on and also when the pumps are on. So that control panel allows for the pumps only to be on and the fountains only to be on when it's actually in use. So that really reduces the amount of power supply for that area. And then later this year, we've got some funding to put in some solar panels onto that water play unit as well. So the pump unit also has sustainable power to it. So we're always looking at ways that we can reduce, reuse, recycle, and make better use of what we've already got. So another thing we need to think about is the changing climate. So I don't know if you've heard of something called the box moth caterpillar. It's a horrible thing. So if you've got box plants or box hedging, one day it looks absolutely perfect. Then another day it's covered in these horrible fine cobwebs and it just kills it. It just kills the whole row of hedge. So it's making it that box plants we can't actually grow in this part of the country anymore. So we need to think of other things that will grow that this type of caterpillar won't attack. And also you may have heard of oak processionary moth caterpillar, and that's another thing, really nasty. So that actually attacks oak trees, and the fine sort of fur of the caterpillar, it can actually cause quite serious harm. So if you breathe that in or get it on your skin, it can cause a massive reaction, serious reaction. And also with ash trees, there's something called ash dieback. So that's come from Europe. So that means you don't actually see many ash trees in this part of the country anymore because it eventually just kills them. And actually I can't remember the last time I saw an ash tree. Still see loads of oak trees. So we need to think about what trees will survive and what plants will survive. And sometimes we're using things that wouldn't normally survive here at all. So I see loads of tree ferns. So they come from Australia and Tasmania. And they seem to do really well actually in London because London's got a slightly higher temperature to the rest of the country. So they seem to thrive. And there's other things as well that you wouldn't normally see here. And what we're finding is that wildlife will adapt to these new plants that we wouldn't normally see. So that means we do get a different type of wildlife that survives here that we wouldn't normally. So as much as it's not good for the wildlife that can't survive, we do have to accept that things will change and we can't stop it necessarily, but we can adapt to it. And that's also what we do within parks through our projects.
That's all for this episode. If If you're enjoying the podcast, then please leave a review, and as always, please do email me with any questions you may have at parks@rbkc.gov.uk.